I am going to introduce Dr. Mark Horowitz, who is an associate professor of sociology at Seton Hall University in South Orange, New Jersey. He teaches and carries out research in the areas of social theory, social psychology, and political economy. And Mark's research over the last several years has focused on political bias in academia, across various fields, including sociology, economics, and anthropology. And during this time, he's incorporated an understanding of evolutionary biology into his research. Now, I met Mark. Mark is a friend of mine, and I met Mark at graduate school at the University of Kansas in the Department of Sociology, where we were both active in the Union for Graduate Teaching Assistants. And at the time, both of us, as did most in our field, subscribed to a blank slate view of the world and human behavior. And this is an Enlightenment theory that states basically that we're born as basically empty containers, and society, the environment, our upbringing sort of instill thoughts, beliefs, and behaviors, personalities into us. And the idea, and this goes back to the Enlightenment, was, well, once you come to the realization of that, you can just unpack everything and then repackage it with truth and how you want to be. You just clean the book out and you can write it from scratch if you want to. And so this theory informs a lot of sort of a framework for academic research, but also for how people want to organize society, for example, right? Like this is the nurture side of the argument, right? And so it affects how we raise kids, right? Social policy, and it is obviously relevant to politics. And since then, Mark and I have both shifted our views, and we both recognize now the role that genetics and DNA play in determining basically individual outcomes. And anyway, needless to say, this debate about nature versus nurture has political implications, and I think this is going to be touched upon by Mark. So without further ado, Mark.
All right, well, thank you, Greg, Jonathan, Matt, other people at the Ethical Culture Society. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, be the first speaker in this series. I certainly plan to come to as many of those as I can participate in. I think it's fair to say that the issue of political polarization has almost become a cliche, ironically. I mean, we hear about it all the time. Everybody's trying to explain it. It's a central theme in talk show and news media. And it's clearly a problem. I would actually suggest it's arguably our most important, I know it's kind of a grandiose thing to suggest, it's our most important social problem. Why do I think that? Well, I think that because any attempt to actually deal with some of the most threatening circumstances of our lives can only be done through a political process. So if we're going to, for example, address climate change, if we're going to deal with militarism, if we're going to address what could arguably be a kind of late moment in capitalist development, where we're seeing automation, AI, other threats really to employment for large numbers of people. You may remember the presidential candidate and then the candidate for mayor of New York, Andrew Yang, wrote a book and launched his entire campaign on the idea that Trump's election bore some significant connection to deindustrialization, which bears a connection to robotization, right? So these are very serious social ills, I think, that are deeply connected to the structure of how our economy works. Are we having a conversation about that? No, we're not. We're screaming at each other, we're pointing fingers, we're calling each other out. We have people lined up in blue teams and red teams. There's a complete, and I would argue catastrophic, erosion of trust in our society today. I'm not just trying to be dramatic in my tone. If you actually look at some of the data in Pew polls and elsewhere, you'll see that people simply do not trust each other. They do not trust organizations like the media and government. Some institutions that used to have some degree of credibility, like academia, are increasingly under assault. So there's serious concern here. And what I hope to do is try to contribute to a group of scientists that are trying to grapple with really the roots of our rancor, as the title suggests. Like, why are we so polarized? And the argument I'm going to make turns out to be multidimensional. I don't know if in a health context, any of you have heard the term biopsychosocial. Sometimes you'll hear that term bandied about. You want to approach a problem in health. You can't just look at it solely through a bio lens. You can't just look at it solely psychologically. You have to understand the interplay of our biology and psychology and social and cultural forces, right? Well, I'm going to unpack that in a slide in just a little bit, because at the end of the day, a lot is going on. But the lion's share of the talk is going to address a component of our polarization that's often neglected for reasons that Greg just alluded to when he talked about our former blank slate view that we had in graduate school. It's still arguably the dominant perspective, sadly, in social science, even though there's been a Darwinian awakening across the sciences. There's, I would say, vast majority of social scientists still adhere to this idea that human beings are effectively born clay, and we're molded by our social environment. We have no underlying biological predispositions that in any way have implications for how our society is organized. Sometimes in political conversation with each other, it comes in the form of a kind of learning theory. So you'll hear people like progressives, and I'm a sociologist. How many people are comfortable saying that you identify on the liberal left end of the political spectrum? Okay, and anybody, anybody on the political right? And this, by the way, is extremely common in any talk that I give in any academic or related setting. You're going to get overwhelming number of liberal left folks. Anybody libertarian? Okay, so it's pretty universal here. The notion that we're blank slates is the suggestion that we have no underlying biological predispositions with any implications for how society is organized. That view takes the form, again, of this learning theory. So progressives will say, they'll say things like, oh, if these people just turn off Fox, can you just turn that thing off for like 5 minutes? And then, you know, maybe switch on MSNBC and you're gonna get a nice large chunk of truth. Now, the problem with that perspective is about 30 to 40% of the public identifies on some level of the political right, and they say the same thing. You know, turn to the trusted source of Fox and you'll see the light, right? So something's going on here. I mean, the Trump phenomenon was sort of incredible in this regard. Having, as I do, a left-wing political sensibility and background, I saw, and I mean no disrespect, but I'm in a room of progressives or at least liberals, so I won't offend anyone, but I saw a kind of narcissistic, very dangerous buffoon. And yet very, very many people, trust me on this, see the precise opposite of that. They see an extremely savvy person fighting the good fight against the illegitimate establishment using the tools of a kind of brilliant business savvy to do so. So we must understand that. And again, the case I'm going to make is that our political orientations bear a relationship to underlying emotions that themselves have a biopsychological foundation. So I'm not suggesting that our politics reduces to biology. Definitely not suggesting that. Social influences matter. They matter a great deal. If you're born and ensconced in one environment as a kid, let's say you grow up in a cult or something, I mean, you're going to be so profoundly molded that you might be closer to clay. But in the vast majority of cases, especially in a setting like modern society, we have a scenario where people, especially with the internet, you have a tremendous opportunity to draw from all these stimuli in the world. And the core message will be, we have predispositions, we gravitate consciously or otherwise when we're young toward particular political stories that we hear. For those of us interested in politics, we come to identify ourselves with a particular team. And given that these political positions are not just intellectual, but deeply emotive, we are quite inclined to feel a sense of righteous rage and anger towards those with whom we don't share our policy and other positions. So I'll be unpacking this slowly throughout the talk. There's going to be a number of video clips. Hopefully that will work out. I have full confidence in Matt. We did some practice runs here. Okay, let me see. Am I cutting off? Okay, good. On my screen, I cut off the quote, so I just want to make sure they're not yours. So it's not like I came to an act of individual introspection with brilliance, this view that our politics. Want me to hold that? Yeah, okay. You're going to step away from the voice. Okay, that's the recording. Yeah, so it wasn't some act of genius on my end that led. Yeah, all people are born alike except for Republicans and Democrats. I often think it's comical how nature often does contrive that every boy and every gal that's born into the world alive is either a little liberal or else a little conservative. So that's from Gilbert and Sullivan. And then finally, Thomas Jefferson. The terms of Whig and Tory belong to natural as well as to civil history. They denote the temper and constitution of mind of different individuals. So this is a long trajectory, and the biology of political difference was 50 years ago and beyond that kind of well understood. It's almost like we moved profoundly away from that. And there's a story behind that maybe we can get into with Q&A. Okay, I'm going to be telling a story that is shamefully not mine. I mean, I'm going to poach from all these different people. So I'm not suggesting that this is my original insight. Maybe I'm putting a spin on it that's cohesive and interesting, hopefully. But I'm going to draw from a wide variety of literature. And what I do is, this is a public talk, so I have slides. I didn't want to clutter them with names of authors and studies that would just make the slides unreadable. So I beg your indulgence. When you're seeing many of these slides, know that they're going to come from one or another of these major books. Probably the most central one is Jonathan Haidt, his book, The Righteous Mind. He's a NYU psychologist. Is there anybody familiar with Jonathan Haidt? So a couple people, okay. Hibbing and Smith and their associates in Nebraska, their work on the biology of political orientation I'll be drawing from as well in their book, Predisposed. And these books themselves, by the way, are almost like meta discussions of a wide array of studies, both in the laboratory and without. Prius and Pickup, they deal nicely with the theme of something I'll hit on later, of authoritarianism. They also address the cultural differences between left and right, which we'll be talking about. This is an excellent book by the science journalist Chris Mooney, who deals with, again, mostly lab-based discussions of the differences between Republicans and Democrats. And then The Big Sort was a book dealing with the demographic and processes involved where people are really sorting themselves by politics into different regions. So the rural-urban split is obviously pretty salient. So it's not just blue states and red states, it's within those states. You have the liberals gravitating increasingly towards cities and conservatives staying in rural areas. In political life today, the action is in the suburbs, isn't it? That's where they're trying to shave off the tiny little bit of the electorate that's not already determined to vote one way or the other. Okay, so in terms of evidence of political polarization, well, here you have just a shrinking number of actually competitive districts. So more and more, for a variety of reasons that we'll get into, you're having politicians run and they know they got it made. So I just mentioned urban area. If you're in like a heavily Democratic urban area, you're not gonna, everything's in the primary now. You win the primary, you got the seat. And the same happens in a lot of rural areas of the country. So this is shrinking. Here, just another, this is even more pessimistic. It puts the number of swing states, or swing districts, pardon me, to like 70 or something, 75. So very, very few. When you look at the ideology of the actual people elected, they're polarizing more and more. So they're getting more extreme within government. And there's a history behind that as well. So here you have a survey of the public. So 81% of Republicans say that the Democratic Party has been taken over by socialists, and 78% of Democrats believe the Republican Party has been taken over by racists. That's a profoundly high number. And again, it's deeply emotive. There are strong feelings of affective polarization, dislike toward the other side, not just disagreement. And again, this goes to why I think this is such an important issue for us to understand. It's not, I mean, I don't want to idealize the past, but I don't think it was as bad as it is today for a variety of reasons. You know, you could disagree in an agreeable way. Today, much less so. You know, obviously the most cliched examples of that would be unfriending people on Facebook and who don't agree with you, and then the proverbial heated exchanges over Thanksgiving dinner, if indeed they are even that amicable. I just mentioned affective polarization. Democrats and Republicans both say that the other party's members are hypocritical, selfish, and closed-minded. They're unwilling to socialize across party lines or even to partner with opponents in a variety of other activities. So this is increasing. Warmth thermometers is something social scientists use. How do you feel about Republicans? How do you feel about Democrats? And they're just going down. Even more significant in like conservative areas of the country that have been, like, if you associate with racism, you'll find conservative Republicans in the South that'll say, I'd rather have my daughter marry a black person than a Democrat. that kind of attitude. So racism still exists, as does this political affect. I wanted to switch to, this comes from the Prius and Pickup book. Do you? So your mechanic and servicing car, I can plead guilty myself. I drive the poor man's Honda Fit. Is that what you have? I think it's the most widely sold car in Europe, by the way, and it's called the Jazz. Is that right? Yeah. So this is an important point. Like, cultural differences have always existed between people, but as people are sorting into more, homogenous, politically homogenous areas, right? These cultural differences take more salience, and as I'll suggest in a moment, political elites manipulate those differences. So if you can run on a cultural identity, then the issues don't matter, right? If somebody's running on something that you value deeply in your sense of self, and that person says climate change is a hoax, well, he's my team, he's my family member, of course it's a hoax. So there's this appeal to emotion and identity rather than reason and evidence in the political sphere. This was through Facebook likes, how they arrived at this, the kind of musical taste people have. Yeah, I pretty much fit. I was wondering about Johnny Cash. I can see he kind of leans a little Democrat. I don't know. What do you think? Think so? Like he'd be the other way? Yeah. There you have it. This is from Grubhub. I mean, I absolutely love chicken tikka masala. I genuinely do. It's like the only, like when I get Indian food, I get it exclusive.
So the blue and the red, is that just more, there's more correlation with the others?
Yeah, so if you're living in a place where, like, I would expect like a highly urban, safely democratic area, you're going to order more of the foods on the left, and contrary-wise on the right. Then. So again, these cultural differences exist. I don't have a more recent data point for this, but I was just mentioning this, upset at marrying members of the other party. It's gone stratospheric with Trump. I just don't have data to show it. Okay, I had mentioned a moment ago that my view is multidimensional. So the argument I make is that we do have emotions that have a connection to our biology and ultimately our genes, and they're a very important and often neglected part of the story of political polarization, but they don't act alone. So what we have is we have an array of social and technological and institutional and cultural forces that are interacting with our evolved human nature to create this kind of collective antagonism that we see in society today. So this I took from a talk by Jonathan Haidt, who I mentioned earlier. I added a couple things and tweaked a few others to make it slightly different. But the main story, when I look at the literature here, there's so many historical factors involved in this, but party realignment from the 60s is a really important thing, particularly in the South. I mean, yeah, so what you had is you had in the South the seat of the Democratic Party for many decades. Yeah, you had a switch. Once they went for civil rights, I was just reading about Johnson. I guess he was really depressed the day he signed the Civil Rights Act. He's like, yeah, we lost the South forever. And it took a while, but that indeed happened. I'm old enough to remember, I don't remember the name. There was a senator from Rhode Island who was a Republican. I'm old enough to remember some like Republicans in the Northeast and Democrats in the South. I mean, obviously we all remember Jimmy Carter, but the general tendency has been to move away from that. This is something clearly Nixon exploited, the racial anxieties with his Southern strategy. But again, any piece alone in isolation doesn't tell the whole story. Everything is multidimensional, right? So I had mentioned the mass sorting. I'm gonna get the political elite strategy in a minute because that will be my first little video clip. Gingrich sort of symbolized the new era that we live in today. I mean, he came in quite self-consciously with a plan to be divisive. And he pioneered, C-SPAN had come out a number of years before he rose into power, and he pioneered going there alone in the chamber and just saying Democrats are evil and just kind of animating the public to really tap into that tribal hostility. He's famous for it. And he discouraged friendships. I mean, a totally different model than what you might associate with, like, what was it? Was Reagan and Tip O'Neill? Was that the famous kind of cross-party identification? That's more or less disappeared now. So never like using the term the good old days or the old days, but I grew up, you had those 3 news channels, and there was such a greater reservoir of sort of shared understanding. Today, we're talking about a post-truth, world. And I think what that means is not that people aren't committed to the truth. Everybody thinks they have access to it. They're just all over the map as to what they believe, and no small part due to social media and news silos. So going back to Fox News, people exclusively watch Fox. People on the liberal left almost exclusively watch MSNBC, maybe a little CNN in the mix there. So again, you're getting silos. I would argue that the news stories are not just news stories on these shows, that the stories people say on the left, or if you want to call her on the left, like Rachel Maddow or something, are going to have a fundamentally different emotive resonance than something you're going to hear about the show. So those political stories are also emotional stories that tap. Oh, thank you. Yeah, those political stories are also emotional stories that tap our underlying sensibilities. I'd mentioned the urban-rural split, the rise of just obviously more and more money in politics. You're going to continue to do. Mudslinging works. If it didn't work, they wouldn't do it. I find this interesting, the end of the Cold War, the loss of a common enemy. There's a decent amount of social psychology and literature that suggests that if you want to unify people, find some enemy everybody can hate. With the elimination of that didn't help. Obviously, we hear a lot about, the demographic changes with immigration, because we're not just frayed politically right now, we're deeply frayed racially. And there's a correlation. So Black and brown people particularly vote overwhelmingly Democratic, although there's been a tiny tweak to that where Trump actually gained ground, and that led to a lot of talking heads discussion. Gerrymandering, increasingly popular. You hear that in the news every day. More educated citizenry can use your education to be even more partisan. This is one of the big findings in political psychology. It's not about being dumb. I happen to believe, I don't know if we're going to get in an argument about it, but I happen to believe in the severe problem of climate change, the real danger that it poses to humanity. If you identify as conservative, the more educated you are, this comes out of Chris Mooney's book, by the way, when I cited earlier, the more educated you are as a conservative, the more you will deny climate change. And the more complex your theory will be, like an international cabal of scientists, I guess, getting paid to deny it.
It's true that the more educated you are, the less likely you are to conservative.
That's generally true, but there's still a lot of highly educated conservatives. They tend to drift into different fields. So if you look, you'll find a lot of conservatives will go into like math-related, engineering-related, and STEM fields. The liberal arts and humanities, overwhelmingly liberal left. My field in cultural anthropology, I can't remember the guy who said, it's like, you'll find an aardvark in a mall before like a Republican sociologist. It just doesn't happen. And that's actually a concern. I'm a member of an organization that Jonathan Haidt started called Heterodox Academy. Even though I'm deeply progressive in my basic sensibilities, I believe we need more conservatives in higher education. It's dangerous when you have these bubbles of self-reference where people don't want to talk about these things. I think part of what Greg mentioned earlier bears on this. If everybody's liberal left, it's easy to maintain a blank slate view because everybody shares those assumptions. Okay, now the danger. The polarization, I would say, is mostly happening among those with a lot of political power who exploit these sensibilities and these cultural identities to divide people, and again, encourage them to define their political interests by identity and team and not by facts, right? So I use this not as the be all and end all. This just strikes me as the earliest one I could find that so crisply captures like how blatant political elites are in trying to exploit these things. And it's a little bit comical, if a bit disturbing.
What do you think of Howard Dean's plans to raise taxes on families by $1,900 a year?
What do I think? Well, I think Howard Dean should take his tax hiking, government expanding, latte drinking, sushi eating, Volvo driving, New York Times reading,
body piercing, Hollywood loving, left-wing freak show back to Vermont, where it belongs.
Got it?
Club for Growth PAC is responsible for the content of this advertising.
Yes.
It's almost humor, you know, it's funny,
But disturbing at the same time,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Well, what I'm going to do now is give like the most ridiculously abbreviated overview of evolutionary biology you're likely to hear in a talk. But it's, in my opinion, absolutely indispensable. So as I mentioned, all of those social and historical and technological and other things that are going on that are really important part of the story, they're not the whole story unless we appreciate human nature. And human nature is not a blank container or a blank slate. We are deeply groupish. Why are we groupish? Well, we're groupish because we evolved in small scale societies over hundreds of thousands of years. And we had to cooperate together as a species. Not all species do. There's lone species out there like a shark that aren't engaging in deep human cooperation, what the great evolutionary biologist called, E.O. Wilson called eusociality. We're not quite ants, right? Or wasps, but we're not sharks either, right? We're somewhere in between. Jonathan Haidt suggests we're 90% chimp and 10% bee. And that 10% B part is really important, right? So what does it mean we did? Well, we developed moral systems. And what those moral systems do is they suppress our self-interest and they foster pro-social, a kind of pro-social suite of emotions, right? In tandem with norms and practices such as gossip or exile, right? You know, everybody loves gossiping. There's entire media associated with gossiping. What is it that we love about that? Oh my God, did you hear what Cindy did? We all just want to go to the water cooler and hear about these things. That's obviously tapping into something pretty instinctual in us, right? Well, we gossiped, we exiled, and if we even had to, and there's a rich anthropological literature on this, we even killed people who defied group norms. And what evolutionary biologists call this is they call it self-domestication. So we weaned the animal side of us. Not completely, it's still there. The best metaphor for this would be thinking about what happened to dogs. I mean, the consensus is that they evolved from wolves. So you go back thousands of years, the wolf that was just a tiny little bit less aggressive would approach the bonfire where the humans were. Maybe some bone would be thrown to the dog. What did humans get from it? Well, maybe the dog would bark if a rival tribe. So there was a symbiotic kind of benefit from this. And over long periods of processes, those dogs that had more docile traits reproduced. And now they have I have a lovely little Labradoodle. I'm biased. I think she's the most wonderful dog in the world. But some of you may have heard of the very famous Soviet scientist Baliev, worked with the silver foxes. Wasn't very many generations. They kept breeding the docile foxes, and then they finally got dog. They're not completely dog-like, by the way, but they're much, much more dog-like than a. Yeah, and actually, that was surprising because it wasn't just temperament. Even though they were only breeding for temperament, the coat changed and the ears started to flop with some of them. So that's what human beings did over thousands of years. We self-domesticated through these processes. We developed moral systems. Why did we do this? Because it enabled us to survive. So the argument I'm making today, for better or for worse, is essentially a Darwinian one. Human beings formed strong networks of cooperation to enable us to survive by developing moral systems to hold us accountable for our behavior, right? Behavior like if you go out and kill the wildebeest, you're not just going to come home and hoard it for yourself. You might feel a higher social emotion. What might that be? It might be shame. And then when you're sick and your friend brings you food, you're going to be appreciative. You'll feel a higher social emotion called gratitude. Well, these social emotions exist in our evolving brains. That also took a long time. And we burn a tremendous amount of energy with the development of our brain, right? So our brains develop, particularly the most important prefrontal cortex, in tandem with language development. All of these moral systems emerge to hold us to account. Personality itself, which I'll be talking about in a minute. Why do we have the personality traits that we do have? Well, they exist because they worked. You know, they were adaptive. The personality traits we have were adaptive. In other words, they enabled our prehistoric ancestors to survive and reproduce. And if you think about it, it's a miracle. Think about the luck for us to be here, right? For you to be here. You know, all the generations before you that had to survive in a world where you just can't get fast food at 12:30 at night, you know, had to navigate a much, much more hostile ecological environment to survive, right? Prehistoric societies constructed sacred symbols. This will be very important to political life because many of these ideas we hold sacred are political identities. We invest tremendous amount of emotion into them. So the earliest clan societies based on the anthropological record tended to sacralize plants and animals that they had around them. So it might be like the wolf clan, the turtle clan. And what happened when people came around those animals and plants is an unleashing of collective energy. And I'm drawing upon the very famous sociologist, Emile Durkheim, who talked about collective effervescence. So human beings feel this tremendous energy. I didn't ask how many of you are deeply religious or devout, but the metaphor would be the feeling you might get when you go into a church or when you see a symbol. It will awaken in you strong emotion, right? Well, this is something that apparently evolved functionally to bond people together into a moral community. Why is that important? Well, if people are actually committed to the group, you're suppressing raw self-interest. And when you suppress raw self-interest, it means you are a pretty strong collective entity, right? It doesn't mean the selfishness goes away, right? There are going to be people in history where there's a battle and they hide behind a tree and then they get to survive and pass on their genes. Now, if they're caught, the community is going to gossip or exile them and shame them, right? But assuming they get away with it, and some people may be tempted to get away with it, but we have another part of us that developed in tandem with this selfish side, this groupish side of us developed too. And this is an idea that comes straight out of Darwin, actually, and it's controversial in anthropology, but it's called group selection. But the basic idea is fairly straightforward. If one tribe is competing for a watering hole in prehistory with another tribe, and watering hole could mean the survival or death of your tribe, by the way, which means your genes are not going to get passed on. Well, if one tribe is, every single person in the tribe is willing in a state of kind of intense collective effervescence to go forward in battle, and deeply, as a matter of fact, they might even feel, and there's lots of testimonials of people at war who will talk about it being the most gratifying moment of their life, the solidarity they felt in the battlefield. And the friendships they forge are transcendent. I use that word intentionally. Military friendships are among the tightest and most cohesive that people can experience in life. Well, that means you're tapping into something deep. But it also means that group that has a lot of those people have fewer free riders. Fewer people who can't wait to hide behind the tree. Well, who's going to win that battle? The half-hearted people that really don't want to be there, or the people that are like, no, we are the crow, and the crow will live beyond this moment. My death serves a higher purpose. The spirit of the crow live among us. Those sorts of sensibilities that we know from the anthropological record were deeply important to humans' groupishness. I cite here, again, the famous, who I made mention to earlier, just passed away this year, E.O. Wilson, as well as David Sloan Wilson, no relation. Sloan Wilson's an evolutionary anthropologist at Binghamton in New York. And this line sort of captures in capsule form what I was just talking about. Selfishness beats altruism within groups. So if you're inside one group and you're selfish, a lot of times you can win. You want to cut corners, right? But the groups that have more altruistic people in them, they outcompete the groups that have more selfish people in them. And one could make the case that that's why the human drama in the great literature of this world often deals with those themes, doesn't it? Someone acted in a petty way or individualistic way and didn't serve his family or his neighborhood or his country the way he should have, right? So it's part of our core personality structure, this inheritance. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about psychology. Notice that I put average in quotes, I'm sorry, in italics, average psychological differences on the left and right. Could not be a more important thing to stress, right? We know that men are on average taller than women, about 5 or 6 inches taller on average. And yet, obviously, I have students that play in the basketball team and these female basketball players tower over me, right? So, but that doesn't mean we can't scientifically approach general populations through the lens of what is most common or average, right? Well, what the research shows in psychology is that there are average cognitive and emotional differences on the left and right. So people who who we're all left liberals here, we have particular psychological, cognitive, and emotive profile that differs systematically from people that end up identifying on the right. How so? Well, conservatives tend to be more careful, vigilant, efficient, and organized. Liberals tend to be more spontaneous, easygoing, and disorganized. There was a political psychologist, Jonathan Jost, teaches at NYU, who did a study with his colleagues on residential apartments near universities. So it was a college student study. And it's going to match your kind of stereotype. When you went into the liberal dorm rooms and apartments, you're going to find more disorganization. You're also going to find things that suggest this concept of openness to experience, which I put there. You're going to find liberals are going to have plane tickets. They'll have different kinds of indicators of a different kind of cultural appreciation. So the stereotype we might associate with the kind of meat and potatoes conservative holds true to a large extent. The dorm rooms of the conservative students tend to have things that suggest order, like maybe like a hamper for clothes, maybe a calendar, and flags, more common on the wall, which will suggest group identity, which we'll get to in a minute. So these two characteristics psychologically are the most salient. Openness to experience suggests somebody who wants to go out and explore the world. I remember I was a kid, my grandfather had these coins from Mexico, and I was, I don't know, 8 years old going, oh my God, Mexico. I just had this romantic, and I just couldn't wait. You know, did I know that, 30 years later, I would do my dissertation research in Mexico? No, I did not. But I wanted to go around the world. And I did travel, not a tremendous amount, but I traveled and I had that interest. But that kind of impulse to want to explore the world and to be open to new cultures and food, bilingual, I decided to learn another language. Some of you may have as well. It's simply an on average more common trait. And again, are there conservatives that are open to experience? Absolutely. And there are liberals that aren't. But on average, you're going to find this to be a regularity. Conscientiousness, which talks about or identifies this idea that you value dependability, order, you make a plan, you set the plan, you realize those goals, efficiency, that kind of mindset, much, much more common on the political right. One point I neglected to mention is that when we're talking about political psychology, it's extremely common for people to think that the speaker must have some kind of agenda. And I'm going to be up here tonight speaking as a progressive, condemning the political right. Nothing could be further than my intention. I have spent the last 6-7 years reading a wide array of literature, deeply committed to just analyzing as well as I can. I'm not naive enough to believe I'm fully free of my moral and emotional sensibilities. I know that's not the case. But since I've been really deeply involved in this literature, my brother and I used to talk about Thanksgiving dinners. I mean, we would intense arguments. My brother's a kind of center-right libertarian. I'm pretty far left. And I haven't had an argument with him in many, many years. And the case I'm going to make today is that people on the left and right really are different people. They emote differently, they identify differently. And if you really deeply appreciate that, then to respond to their point of view with a lot of anger, it would be like getting angry at them for having red hair. It's just, they're just different. Doesn't mean we give up. It's not a fatalistic message I'm sending today. There's room, at least I hope, for people through self-understanding of our tendencies to cooperate and address those social ills I was mentioning earlier. Anyway, forgot that little disclaimer. And I've actually come to appreciate, to some extent, the psychological and moral sensibilities of the political right. I really have. In Chris Mooney's book, I don't know if it's him or he cites someone saying, thank goodness it was Churchill rather than Chamberlain in World War II. There can be settings where right-wing sensibilities are simply what are needed for, even in this case, for our entire Western culture to survive. So I'm obviously not here in a position to say, that liberal left moral sensibilities are the preferred ones. Tolerance of ambiguity tends to be more common on the political left. I had mentioned earlier the overwhelming predominance of liberals in higher education. You kind of got to be comfortable going, yeah, sort of, and maybe on this side, and I see it over here too. If you have that temperament, you're more inclined to go the direction I went in terms of being a professor, right? Other people on the political right, they're not as, on average, they're not as open to this sort of if and. Sometimes in the moral sphere, you'll hear people on the right say, it's just wrong. Don't give me this situational ethics. Things are right, things are wrong. It's a black and white world. Much, much more common. Punishment styles by parents on the political right are more like that. Because I said so. It tends, and I'm sorry to stereotype, but that's a more common kind of punishment style among parents who identify as conservative than a more deliberative approach that you might see among liberal left parents. Okay, so conscientiousness, these are routines and practices that increase predictability serve as an especially important psychological function for anyone who perceives a lot of danger in the world because they add order to a chaos-riven environment. So going back to this idea of selection, of natural selection and social selection, the argument we're encountering in political psychology is that prehistoric societies benefited by having a mix of people with what we would call today left and right-wing moral sensibilities. Why do we need people? Why did prehistoric societies adapt with people on the right? This is controversial in anthropology, but I'm increasingly convinced of it. They've excavated bones, for example, prior to colonialism, which show tremendous violence in prehistory, even possibly the antecedents of war. So if prehistoric communities were in battle with each other, you need to be able to sort of man the barricades. And what does that mean? You need people that are fiercely loyal to the group, that are ready to submit to the leader who's going to charge them in battle. But could everyone be that way? Well, if you're too militant toward the outsider and you get primed for war every time you're interacting with someone who you don't recognize, well, everyone could die. So maybe you need some liberals in the mix that are going to come in and say, you know, maybe we could possibly dialogue, right? The liberals are also likely, because of the tolerance for ambiguity, they might, and they're open to experience, they might be the ones to, you know, the prehistoric liberal-minded individual might say, you know, I think this berry over there really tasted good and nobody got sick afterward. So there's this idea, you know, it's hard to prove. That's one of the difficulties of this kind of evolutionary psychology. It's hard to prove it. We don't have a time machine. But it's an inference to an explanation that makes a lot of intuitive sense, I would argue. So today's conservatives are those that inherited a mix of personality traits that in prehistory were adaptive for that more intergroup conflictual context. So there appears to be a suite of traits linked to fear and survival more pronounced on the political right that manifest in an orientation or keener affinity for hierarchy, stability, group identity, order, and control. Greater sensitivity to both threat and disgust in the environment, including the threatening and disrupting effect of perceived outgroups. I reminded myself to go to the slide before I go to the videos. So here, this was a Reuters poll. And on issue after issue, you're going to find that Republicans tend to be more fear-oriented around a lot of things, right? So illegal immigration, highly threatening, Republicans will say, right? Islam, gay rights, atheism, drug trafficking, terrorism. I mean, you name it, you're going to see, again, the numbers aren't stark, but they're averages. And they speak to this idea that people on the political right live in a profoundly different world. It's the same world, but we perceive it profoundly differently, right? And then there are some issues on the bottom, and I'm going to reveal my own bias here, but I would say climate change is pretty threatening. So would be an area where liberals are much, much more likely to perceive it as highly threatening than conservatives. Okay, let me go back. Now we're going to watch a series of videos. And I think the strategy in watching these videos is to try to, well, number one, put off whatever political, put aside your political sensibilities. I think the first one's of Trump, for example, and try to just focus on what are likely to be the underlying emotions that are being triggered and nourished on the left and right. So think about think of politics, don't think of political policy. Think of just this very primal identification with it's a scary world out there, we need to stick together, which is much, much more likely on the political right, for example. So let me show a few examples of this. This was a poem Trump would.
Even with customized car insurance from Liberty Mutual, I customize everything, like Marco's backpack.
Look at them, blissfully unaware. They don't know that.
Who has heard?
So he would do this on the campaign stump when he would talk about the wall. So, right, and that's relevant to this poem.
The poem called The Snake. So I have it. Does anybody want to hear it again? You sure? Are you sure? Okay. So let's dedicate this to General Kelly, the Border Patrol, and the ICE agents for doing such an incredible job. Right? This was written by Al Wilson a long time ago. And I thought of it having to do with our borders and people coming in. And we know what we're going to have. We're going to have problems. We have to very, very carefully vet. We have to be smart. We have to be vigilant. So here it is, the snake. It's called the snake. On her way to work one morning, down the path along the lake, a tender-hearted woman saw a poor, half-frozen snake. His pretty-colored skin had been all frosted with the dew. "Poor thing," she cried, "I'll take you in, and I'll take care of you." The border. "Take me in, O tender woman. Take me in, for heaven's sake. Take me in, O tender woman," sighed the vicious snake. She wrapped him up all cozy in a comforter of silk and laid him by her fireside with some honey and some milk. She hurried home from work that night, and as soon as she arrived, she found that pretty snake she'd taken in had been revived. "Take me in, O tender woman. Take me in, for heaven's sake. Take me in, O tender woman," sighed that vicious snake. She clutched him to her bosom. "You're so beautiful," she cried. "But if I hadn't brought you in by now, oh heavens, you would have died." She stroked his pretty skin again and kissed him and held him tight. But instead of saying thank you, that snake gave her a vicious bite. "Take me in, O tender woman. Take me in, for heaven's sake. Take me in, O tender woman," sighed the vicious snake. "I have saved you," cried the woman.
You don't mind if I spare you the rest? Yes. Okay. Yeah. Okay, I believe this might be the former governor of Texas.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Rick Perry.
This is the best decision you're ever going to make. That's not
At a primary debate, I believe.
Governor Perry, question about Texas. Your state has executed 234 death row inmates, more than any other governor in modern times. Have you struggled to sleep at night with the idea that any one of those might have been innocent?
No, sir, I've never struggled with that at all. The state of Texas has a very thoughtful, a very clear process in place of which when someone commits the most heinous of crimes against our citizens, they get a fair hearing, they go through an appellate process, they go up to the Supreme Court of the United States if that's required. But in the state of Texas, if you come into our state and you kill one of our children, you kill a police officer, you are involved with another crime and you kill one of our citizens, you will face the ultimate justice in the state of Texas, and that is you will be executed.
What do you make of what do you make of that, Dan?
We're worried that you're executing
Innocent people. So again, I do beg your indulgence. I'm not asking you to do a kumbaya hug if you're somebody deeply on the political left, but just try to imagine feeling something different and having those feelings, if you believe the political psychological consensus, that those actually had a, even at birth, predisposition. You already were sort of oriented to fear the world, want a strong leader, feel a strong sense of group loyalty, which we'll talk about in a minute. So those are the emotions that get gratified. This is not about reason. This is about emotion. The only chance reason can win this is what I think we have to do as a collective society, is that all of us, both liberals and conservatives, maybe it's a pipe dream, can, through a process of sort of using science and harnessing this understanding, begrudgingly come to understand we're different people and then cooperate. Let me, now this is Michael Moore. What's that? This is Michael Moore on, I think, the Bill Maher show. And it's interesting how I had mentioned earlier how you can, he sort of refers to appreciating the other side on a certain level, even if it's with a hint of irony. Sorry.
60-40 or 70-30, but one side doesn't get out and vote.
Well, on the
if you
issues,
look at,
yes.
Right, if you look at all these issues.
I'm not talking about votes, I'm talking about critical issues.
No, but even on those issues, 67% of people do not want to repeal Roe v. Wade.
But what do you...
70% of people are pro a DACA solution. 60 to 70% of the people do not want a wall. Again and again, the problem is one side does not vote.
Or no,
and if you don't show up, the other side will.
Or no, they don't vote, or they don't even know about these issues or what side the person is on. I mean, Harley Davidson, this is your issue. Your whole life was saving jobs. Somehow Donald Trump has stolen your issue, but he's not really delivering. I mean, how does he keep the Harley Davidson people on his side when he's losing them jobs?
Well, he won't. That people will. Listen, the Harley Davidson people and the people in Michigan, the states that Hillary lost, they wanted to throw a Molotov cocktail into a system that had hurt them.
Right.
They are not Trump lovers, and Jennifer's right. They have to get out and vote. But this is the beauty and the genius of Trump, and why you have to step back for a second and admire him the way Patton admired Rommel. That Trump. When he says he's going to do something, he's going to do it, and he is relentless. Yeah. He's even though he did what he did this week with the children in the cages, but he's still going to have the internment camps. He's never going to give up on this. Never going to give up on the wall. They are never going to stop. And we never act like that on any of the things that we say we believe in. They are relentless. Right. They are motherfuckers to the core, and we are like, oh, somewhere. So that's how we are, and we have got to stop.
He reminds me a lot of Dick Cheney. He's not as smart as Dick Cheney, but he's relentless, he's ruthless.
Right.
Okay, so why do I think that there's biology in this? Why do I think these emotions that are getting gratified, couldn't they have been learned? Couldn't it be that, you know, oh, your parents kind of taught you to respond to someone like Trump in one way, or taught you to respond to Hillary Clinton in another? Well, it turns out there's a wide array of literature, none of which...
If you want to make our country safer
Sorry
for
about that.
violent criminals, vote for the radical Democrats.
Did I lose my place now, though? I think I did. Let me find the slide here. Okay. Oh, why did it do that? I went from current slide and I went to the beginning. It's bizarre. All right, I'm hitting on the slide, and now I'm going to hit from current slide. Okay. So, you know, why do I believe this is something that's not purely social? Well, there's a wide array of literature, none of which alone, I would say, is overwhelmingly convincing. It's not like I'm going to point to one thing and you say, absolutely agree. But when a wide array of literature consistently points in the same direction using different kinds of methodologies, it strongly suggests to me that there's something biopsychological going on. And the story that I provided earlier, albeit in abbreviated form, that evolutionary story, makes a tremendous amount of sense, right? I showed you that book by Hibbing and Associates called Predisposed. They bring people in using an eye tracker technology. So there'll be people that are self-defined liberals and self-defined conservatives in the lab. And they have them look at a collage of images. And they call the images either aversive or appetitive stimuli, okay? Positive or negative stimuli, basically. And so you'll have like an image of someone eating worms, for example, or an open sore. You'll have an image of little puppies or a rainbow. So what they find using eye tracker technology, and again, we're talking about, I don't even know if it might be nanoseconds, it's at least milliseconds, right? What you'll find is that the self-identified conservatives, when looking upon a collage, will home in more quickly on negative stimuli. And then they'll dwell on it longer. And liberals are the opposite. So liberals, well, they home in. We're equipped by natural selection. A snake comes in this room. I don't care how captivating my talk is. You guys are jumping up. It's just going to be very instinctual, right? So liberals.
You mean I wouldn't actually just give it
You might not. The precious snake. Right. Yeah, so all of us, I think, will react to negative stimuli. Conservatives will be quicker, and then they'll dwell longer. Liberals will shift quicker to positive stimuli, and then they'll dwell on them longer. So you're looking at the little puppy, and what emotions get unleashed, right? And if you're somebody who's taken on a political identity, what it means is you're like an emotion triggerer on the left and right. And you're used to just triggering those emotions all the time, right? And then if you're a partisan, you can't wait to find that Democrat. You can't wait to argue with them because you feel the truth. The problem is, so does he. So that's what the war of politics is about. Two emotional tribes going at it, cherry picking information that fit their argument and getting kudos from their respective teams for standing up for principle. Policy in all of this often gets lost, right? So that's a whole cluster of studies by Hibbing and Associates. There are brain differences, actual physiological on average differences. The amygdala is associated with processing fear. And the right amygdala is systematically bigger among conservatives than among liberals. The anterior cingulate cortex is associated with, it's in the prefrontal cortex, it's associated with deliberation over stimuli, even like the capacity to change your mind, if you would. And you'll notice a virtue on the political right. I remember this a number of years ago with the Bush election and Iraq war, stay the course, the conservatives will say, right? You know, I remember John Kerry and the commercials, the word flip, flop. I mean, I'm an academic. Flip, flop sounds like I want to encourage it. It's called critical thinking. You know, you don't want to be too committed to something. You want to bring in evidence, weigh all the different sides. Well, maybe there's an emotional temperament that undergirds my interest in that kind of perspective.
But this is, with every adults, we're working on dating this thing.
Well, I think
so that doesn't tell me that it came from genetics.
Well, okay, let me give you the strong. So you're thinking the physiological differences don't.
Not so much genetics.
So you're thinking the amygdala is changing size based on family. By the way, I don't know. I'm skeptical of that take, but I hear you. And as I said a minute ago, one piece of data alone, I wouldn't expect to sway. The biggest thing that changed my mind, I mean, Greg mentioned earlier, we were blank slaters. Twin studies was like a punch in the stomach. Because coming out of a progressive point of view, I had this like, if we can just provide the facts, people will come around, you know? And it's like, well, twin studies are pretty compelling. There's a field called behavioral genetics. They've been doing twin studies systematically since the 70s. There was a meta-analysis done by a researcher named Hatemi in 2018, which pointed to 14 million twin pairs. Now, the reason I say that slowly, there's just nothing like it in my field. We have people doing dissertations talking to 30 people, for example. I mean, 14 million, this is thousands and thousands of studies been carried out since the 70s. And what do these studies do? And this kind of addresses your question about why would we believe this is biological? Well, what the studies do is they compare monozygotic identical twins with dizygotic fraternal twins. I happen to be a fraternal twin. Anybody else? Am I alone here? Okay. Well, and they compare them on an entire array of traits, every possible trait you can imagine. And guess what you're going to find? If I had, let's say I said to you I was an identical twin today, my brother's in the hall, and I tell you I'm 6 feet tall, and you're going to get $1,000 if you guess right. How tall are you going to guess him to be?
6 feet tall.
Okay, now if he's my fraternal twin, do you expect him to be 6 feet? Would you put as much money on it?
No.
You're going to, by the way, your intuition right now is 100% confirmed by tons of twin studies going back decades. Identical twins are closer in those traits. But here's the rub. They're closer in every single psychological trait you can imagine, even our political values.
But the ones that raised separately.
Well, I haven't gotten that yet. Oh, hold on. That's okay, no worries. I appreciate your energy, by the way, and enthusiasm. So even our political values have a high degree of heritability, sometimes as high as 40 to 50%. A variation in a population studied is explainable by genes. So why would it be? You know, fraternal twins are growing up together also. Why are the identical twins closer to being, say, Democrat or Republican, or closer to being fundamentalist Christian than the fraternal twins. Twins reared apart. Turns out there's been a few hundred of them since the 70s. There's a study by Thomas Bouchard, the MISTRA, Minnesota study for twins reared apart. First of all, the samples has to be low, obviously, just because how often does that happen? Have any of you seen that excellent documentary, Three Identical Strangers? So it has obviously some information there that speaks to this as well. Well, it turns out, this might surprise you. What's your name? Kevin, this might surprise you. No statistical difference in closeness. So even when twins are reared apart, they're just as likely to be closer. So what this means is that I'm an identical twin and my identical twin, I don't know, gets switched at the hospital room and brought to some other family. And I grow up with, let's say, another brother who was born at the same time. I don't know, can you have identical with fraternal? I think you can. I think you can have two eggs, one of them split into identicals. Play along with this here. That fraternal brother will be less close to me, even if my brother's born and raised in another family. Data like this was devastating to me, because once I opened my mind to this kind of information and realized, wow, everything seems to be pointing in the direction of genetic influence. I say influence because 40%, 50%, that's not 100. Now, height, physical height is something like 90% heritable. IQ is pretty close to it. By the time you become a late teenager, it's like 80%, 70 to 80% heritable. And this has implications because, we used to think, we put tremendous amount of weight on childhood upbringing, and it's important, don't misunderstand me. Greg and I have had some colorful discussions debating how big nurturance is. You do have to have a base level of nurturance. And these twin studies deal with quote unquote average populations and twin registries around the world. So if you're abusing and neglecting a child, it's going to have significant impact. But assuming some basic level of treatment, genes end up having a very significant but not totally determinative influence. Sort of if you're gay as an identical twin, your identical twin has like a 30 to 40% chance of being gay. So that's interesting. Same exact genes, yet it's not 100%. So something's going on biologically in interaction with the cultural and social environment that we poorly understand. We're yet to figure it out. But it's obviously not zero genes, because your chance of being gay just randomly is like 5%. Right? So this is why it's a biosocial approach. It's not a bioreductionist approach. But the reason it's important goes back to the earlier point I made. If it's biological, it means it's deeply emotional and it speaks to some what we might call our most sacred values. And it makes it tougher to challenge political polarization, given that it has that emotive foundation. All right, now we're getting to the meat of the political side. Jonathan Haidt had the biggest impact on me of all the thinkers that I read. He developed an approach called moral foundations theory. And it turns out massive surveys on his webpage, tens if not hundreds of thousands of people who reveal their positions on a wide array of different things, or how they react to particular hypothetical scenarios or statements. And what they discover is that liberals have a 3 foundation morality, where conservatives have a 6. Care and harm, liberty and oppression, and fairness stand out far and away among liberals. So if you think about, there's a stereotype called the bleeding heart liberal. That has a huge chunk of truth to it. This CARE Foundation, which I have a video clip on this, which will be very useful, explain better than I will, moral foundations theory. We genuinely do, I say we as a liberal, we do kind of cry for the polar bear. I see some of those images, I don't know about you, when you see those big game hunters kill a lion, I get depressed for like a day. And I feel, I'm sorry, but if you guys are hunters, I mean no disrespect, but I just feel hatred. They're going and they're shooting a gun at some beautiful creature. I can't even talk about it. Talk about emotions start coming to the fore here, right? So that CARE Foundation is extremely strong. There's a super sensitivity about oppression on the left too. When I was in undergraduate, kids would wear buttons, like my liberal friends, left-wing friends, subvert the dominant paradigm, which is really, really arcane sounding, right? But you're subverting, and you're not allowing dominant, you're not allowing the bully to oppress you. This is also something that you see on the right. And this is a very, very important point. The right has all of these moral sensibilities. The left, overwhelmingly, those first 3. And the sensibility of fairness on the left has a different texture. Liberals basically want everybody to have a chance regardless of their performance. You know, you think of it like the liberal parents, everyone's a winner, give them a trophy, even if that sort of sensibility. You're not likely to find that on the conservative end of the spectrum. Much, much more common on the political left. On the political right, there's much more reciprocity. Pull your weight, mister. Right? My brother's on the center right? He makes fun of my liberalism and my sensibilities. His son took an EMT course. His son's super smart, but he can be lazy. And so I'm talking to my brother, and he says, yeah, Nikki didn't show up, failed the EMT test. And I'm on the phone with my brother. I'm like, oh, God, poor kid. Must be so embarrassed. My brother goes, poor kid? That course cost me $1,000. Study harder. Very angry at his son, right? You know, this again, go back to, it sounds absurd to compare this to prehistory, but think of like prehistoric conservative minds. It's a dangerous world out there. You know, gather the berries, hunt together. We don't have time for this activity, right? So it appears to be that there's these emotions that get nourished and triggered that ultimately become embedded through story, because we're a deeply cultural species. Stories and identities are very important to us. And once we commit to it, and it becomes very ossified, very rigid. That's why it's often hard for people to switch political teams in life. And by the way, super hard for me. I was such a devout, I guess I'll use that word, leftist, that when I first encountered Jonathan Haidt and read books, I wouldn't even read people on the political right. Very famous economists like Thomas Sowell. I don't know if anybody ever heard of him. When I first started reading these people, I had to literally go, trying to read like famous conservatives like Edmund Burke or something, trying to read it going, oh, I literally felt disgust. But it was only through a process. I think very principled liberals might look at me and go, oh, he's lost now. He's abandoned principle. And I can't disagree with that more. My worldview has been expanded overwhelmingly by this openness, and I have not abandoned my progressive policies or positionalities. I can just talk more effectively, at least I hope, with people on the political right. That's why I kind of wish there were people on the political right among the group. We had a couple people leave. I wonder if they were on the political right, yeah. And what was this supposed to end at what time?
Well, we should just have time for questions. So maybe.
How much more minutes do I have?
Just wrap it up.
Oh, wow, I'm gonna rush through then. Maybe, you know what, then maybe, let me let the video explain moral foundations. It'll do it better than I. And it's only 6 minutes, is that?
And then wrap it up after that.
So this was supposed to end at 6:30 for everybody?
Place your notebooks and print.
Are people comfortable going a little longer or? A little bit?
Your documents.
You have to leave, you have to, no offense taken.
Remarkable too. The only tablet.
I got a question. What is morality?
Morality.
Turn individuals into communities. I think it goes without saying that the survival advantage between your average survivalist and the United States military is pretty enormous. And there's an argument to be made that without these moral emotions and the moral communities that they create, modern civilization could likely be very different. The theory of moral emotions is relatively new. It's called Moral Foundations Theory, and it's based on the scientific research of Jonathan Haidt, Craig Joseph, and a team of social psychologists at yourmorals.org, and builds on the previous work of cultural anthropologist Richard Schwader and French sociologist Emile Durkheim. You can read more about it on Wikipedia or moralfoundations.org, where it states, Moral Foundations theory was created by a group of social and cultural psychologists to understand why morality varies so much across cultures, yet shows so many similarities and recurrent themes. In brief, the theory proposes that several innate and universally available psychological systems are the foundations of intuitive ethics. Each culture takes these base intuitions and constructs virtues, narratives, and institutions on top of them, creating the unique set of moralities we see around the world today. You can think of these moral foundations like the very basic flavors we all use, sweet, salty, sour, to make up the world's wide array of cultural cuisines. Currently, there's evidence for 6 evolutionarily based moral foundations, and I'm going to go through them all briefly, but researchers in the field admit this list may not be exhaustive. Future psychological or sociological research could uncover more. 1. care harm. Probably the most obvious of the moral foundations. We're all mammals with strong evolutionarily based attachment systems binding us to our families and young. These attachment systems allow us to empathize with others, feeling in ourselves others' pain and suffering. This system evolved to give our species a survival advantage in the production of strong and viable offspring, but is also useful inside our moral communities in fostering kindness, gentleness, and nurturant feelings towards our peers and the wider community at large. 2. Fairness cheating. With an emphasis on proportionality, the Fairness Cheating Foundation evolved as a mechanism to aid us in our pursuit of reciprocal altruism. Reciprocal altruism works when we receive a fair portion for the effort we contribute, but the whole system can break down if free riders step in, siphoning off disproportionate resources from the group. To deal with the free rider problem, humans evolved a keen sense of justice, rights, and fairness. These intuitions fill us with angry indignation whenever we see others in the group taking more than they contribute or deserve. 3. Loyalty betrayal. This foundation evolved during our long history as tribal organisms, able to form shifting and beneficial coalitions. It underlies the virtues of patriotism and self-sacrifice for our group or tribe. The evolutionary system is active anytime we feel the sense that it's all for one and one for all. This foundation was critical during our evolutionary development when changing climate and limited resources encouraged groups of individuals to band together. Any group or tribe that was able to monopolize shelter and resources had a distinct survival advantage over less cohesive groups. These less loyal groups could easily disband or become the subjects of conquest by more cohesive groups. 4. Authority subversion. We evolved from lower primate species. The Authority Subversion Foundation evolved during our long primate history when our daily lives revolved around hierarchical social interactions. It underlies the virtues of leadership and followership, including deference to legitimate authority and respect for family and cultural traditions. Like the Loyalty Betrayal Foundation, Authority Subversion gave groups of individuals a distinct survival advantage through the ability to work together swiftly and efficiently as a strong and cohesive team. 5. Sanctity degradation. This foundation was shaped by the psychology of disgust and contamination. It evolved to meet the adaptive challenge of the omnivore's dilemma and the broader challenge of surviving in a world of pathogens and parasites. The moral emotion surrounding this foundation is the feeling of disgust. This feeling evolved to defend our mouths and bodies from dirty or inappropriate contaminants and has been appropriated by our moral reasoning to extend that disgust to certain people, groups, symbols, or ideas with any potential to contaminate our moral communities. 6. Liberty oppression. This foundation centers around the feelings of resentment towards people or organizations who dominate or restrain us. These intuitions are often in conflict with those of the Authority Subversion Foundation, forcing us to strike a balance between the two. The emotions surrounding the Liberty Oppression Foundation involve the hatred of bullies and dominators, motivating people to come together in solidarity to oppose and or kill any would-be oppressors. These emotions likely developed once our species evolved the ability to make and use tools. With the advent of weaponry, reverse dominance hierarchies allowed our species to develop a more egalitarian lifestyle, since keenly aware individuals could now easily unite with weaponry against any domineering alphas that might threaten or even annoy the group. So what's your take?
80% of them about revenge, especially like male-oriented action films. There's some great injustice and you're balancing the equation, right? Yeah, exactly. I mean, so it just speaks to these very, and being a progressive, the theme of justice was part of the title of my dissertation in sociology. It's just, we want to right the wrongs of the world, these illegitimate inequities in the world, right? In terms of this issue of sanctity and feelings of disgust, I had just made an example of that when I was forcing myself to read thinkers that I just emotively hated. Why would I read Thomas Sowell? He's just some economist who wants to justify capitalism and justify, blame black people for their poverty. I don't want to read him. He's just a bad person. And so to force myself to try to read these people, I genuinely felt it. And I see pictures of Trump and I do feel disgusted. I apologize, but I genuinely do. I don't want to. But again, these are instincts that we have. It's very, very important to understand them on that level. These are some bumper stickers and signs at protests. Does this strike you as the left or the right? Tax the wealthy, fair and square, pardon me. We can feel each other, heal each other, and break these walls. Is that left or right, do you think? Absolutely. I mean, the nations one of, if not the most popular left-wing periodical sold in the country, and its motto is insubordination. Again, you're challenging authority. That tendency to like feel this awe for the leader, like the founding fathers, is much, much more likely to be a right-wing sensibility. I'm so far on the left that when I was a kid in elementary school learning about Benedict Arnold, I remember going, well, what did he do? Why is he so bad? Like, I was like, maybe I would have done the same. You know, it just didn't immediately trigger this feeling of like, right? But could you imagine somebody who happened to be different emotionally, where that just lockstep triggers in? Yes, he's a traitor. Edward Snowden. I'm sorry, I'd probably put a poster up of him. My brother wants to behead him. You were part of a team, you signed up, you're working for the government. It's just a stronger emotive valence linked to your duty, which is also a right-wing, more conservative term. It resonates more deeply with the right than the left. Doesn't mean we don't feel it on the left. And that's a crucial point, by the way, averages again. These moral intuitions are like dial settings, where the left jacked up on care and fairness and anti-oppression. And the right, you could have some jacked up on authority and loyalty to the group, right? Let me show you. So another progressive one, no ban, no wall. Again, openness to experience, these psychological tendencies. My favorite one, let's see. Yeah, this from this kid here. Trump needs to learn to be nice and kind. So just the CARE Foundation right there on display. Is this on the left? Obviously not. God's in charge, so shut up. Obviously, America, love it or leave it is a common, right, maxim on the right. And again, this sensibility about the free rider. When I first encountered the term free rider, I honestly, because my moral sensibilities aren't triggered, I couldn't understand it. I scratched my head. What does it exactly mean, a free rider? And it just didn't resonate with me. On the right, it's deep. Pull your weight. Our group hinges on everybody pulling their weight. Don't be a slacker. They feel it. They feel it and believe it. This kind of moral psychology isn't usually like focused on an individual personality. It's like autobiographical. My take on things is that if he didn't have it in him, he wouldn't be as good at triggering it and manipulating the public. So I actually do believe it, but not that it's not interesting. It's less interesting a question. I think both. I think both. I think our self-interest and our moral intuitions are harnessed in those circumstances. Exactly. Going back to that ad I showed you earlier, they weaponize these differences all the time because we're in a competitive market system. Republicans work. We work so you don't have to. Sometimes war is the answer. So we're over time a little bit, not much, and I'm almost done. And there's no rebellion from the group yet.
Did you know there's a new reverse mortgage on the block? Meet Arlo, the reverse mortgage without expensive closing costs.
Let me ask you this hypothetical.
So this kind of sensibility on the political right is far more pronounced. I just mentioned, pull your weight. It reminds you of like the old Aesop, like the grasshopper and the ant. Remember that parable? You know, you're not working over the winter, you're gonna die out in the cold, and guess what? You deserve it. That just does not resonate with the left. Right, so I remember reading Aesop. My grandfather had them, and I didn't really resonate with all of them, the stories. And again, what we usually think of as just being purely cerebral is actually deeply bio-emotional at the same time. So this is a very famous interaction with Ron Paul, the libertarian candidate in Texas, and Wolf Blitzer.
Question. A healthy 30-year-old young man has a good job, makes a good living, but decides, you know what? I'm not going to spend $200 or $300 a month for health insurance because I'm healthy. I don't need it. But, you know, something terrible happens. All of a sudden, he needs it. Who's going to pay for if he goes into a coma, for example? Who pays for that?
In a society that you accept welfareism and socialism, he expects the government to take care of him.
What do you want?
But what he should do is whatever he wants to do and assume responsibility for himself. My advice to him would have a major medical policy, but not before.
But he doesn't have that. He doesn't have it, and he needs intensive care for 6 months. Who pays?
That's what freedom is all about, taking your own risk. This whole idea that you have to prepare and take care of everybody.
But Congressman, are you saying the society should just let him die?
No.
He goes on to say, hopefully the church will step in. And he talks a little bit, but the idea of like a mandate where that's socialism, right? And he goes, the idea that we have to care about each other. And again, I know if you're progressive in your sensibility, you might just be hearing like, just a jerk, basically, you incompassionate jerk. But just imagine if you happen to have those sensibilities just by the accident of your birth. And then you had parents, by the way, there's going to be a correlation. Usually when you're blank slate sociologist, you think, oh, well, you're brought up liberal, you'll be liberal, brought up conservative. And I used to think that. And the problem with that is like, well, my brother and I, he's on the right, I'm on the left, my sister's in the middle. There's always a black sheep of the family. Something's going on here. And it sounds a lot like people are inheriting certain complexes of genes. And I need to make a crucial point about genetics. Candidate genes is not the story anymore. There was hope that there would be candidate genes. They would explore the genome and find like a crucial gene. It turns out the consensus now is thousands of genes act in concert around small effects that do aggregate though into different. So going back to the way I see political orientation, the CARE Foundation just has a different synaptic structure linked to thousands of different kinds of genes that you accidentally inherited through a roll of the dice. But if your parents were liberal left, they have more of them. But even the conservatives have them too. And you can have a deeply liberal kid who the parents still love, but they're like, what happened? We raised him wrong. When in reality, he's simply animated by different kinds of sensibilities than his brother or sister.
But if you have a different mixture of these genetic cofactors,
Yes.
how you see that it seems to me that you get more of a bell distribution of characteristics rather than a bifurcation into two peaks.
Yeah, I actually see it the latter. I see the data suggests that it's like a camel's 2 humps with a significant hump in the middle. So maybe a 3-hump camel if that existed. Dromedary, I always mix them up. The dromedary. It would suggest that if the data show that there's 3 humps, we have the liberals over here, the moderates, and then the conservatives, it would suggest that on the far left, different sorts of genes are wiring us differently than in the far right. And then I haven't figured, I was talking to you before the talk, I haven't fully understood, is it the case that moderates are people who have kind of a mixed wiring of genes? I don't think we even know the genome well enough to know. What I am increasingly convinced of though, we can't talk about any of this without at least bringing bio into the story. We can no longer think about politics as socially determined or a learning theory alone. People aren't clay. We have predispositions, and you know when you're talking to someone, no amount of facts works usually. I mean, how often have you been in that situation? You know, you're losing an argument, but you dig in your heels. You know, my brother and I used to argue about it all the time. And what we call it in psychology is confirmation bias, right? You get on the internet and you just find whatever you need to find to prove your side of the story because you're deeply emotionally committed to finding it, right? So I do believe that that there are complex things we're still figuring out with the genome that are going to end up being discovered in coming decades that are associated with certain kinds of emotions that then get commandeered into particular political teams and particular historical contexts. And so people really fundamentally are different. I was going to give this one. So this was supposed to end at 6:30 or 7. So it's up to you guys. We can just do questions right now. I'm happy with that. I had 2 more slides. Or 3. That's a little too long, maybe. This one's just creepy. It's kind of funny. Yeah, let's just go to the end. Okay, well, this is creepy and funny. So I'll read this to you, and just let me read it and just maybe talk a little bit about how you felt. And then I would love your point of view on this. So Julie and Mark are brother and sister. They're traveling together in France on summer vacation from college. One night, they're staying alone in a cabin near the beach. They decide that it would be interesting and fun if they tried making love. At the very least, it would be a new experience for each of them. Julie was already taking birth control pills, but Mark uses a condom too, just to be safe. They both enjoy making love, but they decide not to do it again. They keep that night as a special secret, which makes them feel even closer to each other. What do you think about that? Was it okay for them to make love? Any thoughts on that?
First, I was like, ooh. You know, that's not good. Okay, we can, right?
Say it again?
There was a pregnancy, though. Yeah. There was a recent one. It's their secret.
Well, what Haidt discovers when he sets up all these vignettes, this is sort of the most jarring one, so I wanted to show it to you. And what people tend to do is they say, oh, what about pregnancy, a deformed child? Well, the problem is she's taking birth control and he's taking a condom. And so what Haidt's argument is that when you're really opposing this, you're not opposing it for that reason. That's what's called a post hoc rationalization, that you feel first. What he means by moral intuitions are emotions that are unconscious. Something hits you in the gut, and by the time you're up here arguing, you already made up your mind. And now you're just finding something to say that it's wrong. The only people that say this isn't wrong are far left people and libertarians. And even in that case, by the way, what I think's going on is they go, and then they go, Care Foundation, well, no one's getting hurt. I guess I kind of got to say, it's not my business. So what do you guys think? Is it wrong? Is it morally wrong in your view, what Mark and Julie did? Well, that's fitting the Haidtian model right there.
But, like you say, you know, I mean, what if they were still punished for it? They were both. So is this a good time to start doing it?
Sure, it's fine with me. Well, I did have a little takeaway slide. I can skip this one, it's not that important. But here's like a takeaway. So begrudging recognition that people with different political positions are different people who emote differently might help us resist the impulse to vilify those with whom we disagree, even profoundly. Such recognition may lead us to listen better to our political opponents and to receive their views charitably. I love this quote by John Stuart Mill. He who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that. And then finally, try to resist what I call the tribal temptation. I've been working on notes for a book, and I'm tempted to call it Resist the Tribal Temptation. The ego gratification that comes with throwing proverbial red meat to one's political team. Introspect and examine your own emotions that may blind you to the legitimate concerns and insights of your political adversaries. So that would be my sort of meta message out of this. Maybe it's wishful thinking, I don't know. Yeah, we can do Q&A.
Okay, everybody, we're already over time a little bit. That's okay.
Not a big deal. So we'll just do a real brief kind of Q&A where people maybe give their thoughts, ask a question. And even after we're officially done this day, honestly, I don't know, Ray, do you want to mention this? I think someone's heard it. And all of your interrogate Mark about his viewpoints. So this is a good time to ask questions. I will say though, if you have not been to the ethical Westchester Community for Ethical Culture, the new name, please, if you could, before you leave, sign in. I just ask you to put back your name and your phone number, if you don't mind. Because we would like to let you know about future events that we want to have. Other than that, if you can donate a few dollars, we would be very appreciative because we are trying to do this every single month. So we would appreciate that very much. And yes, okay, let's open it up. Who would like to do something to say?
Jonathan, do you want to take the lead in the picking people?
Pass it around. Let's start with Ed here. Wondering if there is research in whether the intensity of political actions has to do with a society where more people have less meaning, sense of meaning in their personal lives, which I know.
Oh, did it?
I'll switch. Yeah. Okay, this one. And actually, I could probably just talk.
Yeah. Is this better? Okay. Okay, good. So what I was asking was, is there research on this intensity of our political passions now, whether right or left, has something to do with the lack of meaning in people's personal lives because of all the changes in our society. And this has happened, say, after World War I in Germany, where people lost meaning in their lives. And then there was a galvanizing political movement that seemed fantastic to them, to many of them. And also, I can cite other areas in the world, in the Middle East, where people go into this jihad movement because they don't have much personal meaning in their lives. Has that been studied about the US now, what's going on here?
I know there's literature on the crisis of meaning, like that's happening. More and more people are kind of gravitating toward like identifying themselves almost nihilistically, but I haven't seen it linked to, therefore they embrace like extreme emotional positionalities as a way to forge meaning, but it makes compelling sense to me. So my short answer is I don't know, there may exist. I don't want to, my experience is not to, I know that empirical trend is there and I'm interested in it. So yeah, it's high degree of plausibility.
I was just thinking, if there is a genetic basis for republicanism and being a Democrat or having these leftward, right-leaning things, does that mean it's going to get worse and get more polarized? Because if you're with more people who are left-leaning, you're more apt to have relationships and children with other left-leaning people, and vice versa. So it's going to be genetically like more like isolated.
Absolutely, that's exactly what's happening. It's called assortative mating, and it's happening a lot, and it's very dangerous. And keep in mind, we've always had these sensibilities. This goes to the multidimensionality again, which is very important. We're in a historical moment. Our species did not have, social media hundreds of thousands of years ago. We have all these opportunities now to break into and just live in bubbles. In the olden days, sorry to use the term, your neighbor was kind of a schmuck. I got the Yiddish in me. And yep, you loved him though. You disagreed with him, but he was your neighbor. You knew who he was. You went to the dinner together. He was your friend. Those sorts of cross-cutting alliances that were more important than political sensibilities are going away. People are increasingly going, saying, I don't like that person. And what my mission is, first of all, to help us understand why that's happening because of all these multidimensional factors, but then secondly, to put a brake on it. And going back to my takeaways, if we continue to feed into this, we're going to have a very divided society. And again, I've even heard the term civil war bandied about. I don't want to be, again, too alarmist in my rhetoric, but there's pretty serious degree of social and political polarization. And I would say a childish reduction of politics to name calling and a release of tremendous anger. And the only way that's going to stop is if it stops working. The only way it's going to stop working is if more and more people decide that they're not going to indulge in a feeling of righteous superiority. Doesn't mean you don't fight people. I personally, a slide I didn't show you, I personally consider the political right more dangerous. I just do. And you may believe it's because I'm a liberal and maybe I am primed to see it in some way, but it's just climate change and these are structural problems we have to maturely discuss. And they don't even believe climate change is even occurring, never mind getting to some kind of reasonable discussion. I think Trump made it illegal for people to say climate change in his in his administration, thank you. Yeah, so I mean, this is very, very dangerous. So you're not going to beat him with facts, I promise you that. So yes, mobilize. Yes, engage in politics. But politics at the polls is only the end of a long process where we have to talk and communicate with each other. So that could mean decide to watch right-wing media. I'm saying this because I know you guys are on the left. I know, but just, I don't have time to get into it, but it turns out left liberal sensibilities are blinding too. My research is on how liberal academics don't like certain arguments, including evolutionary arguments, because they so deeply care about equality and fairness to everyone. They don't want to believe there's a natural inequality between human beings. And that blinds us to certain sorts of hypotheses in social science. So everybody is blinded in their own ways. There's lots of good scientific and political reasons to try to move beyond this. Yeah.
Yeah. I understand that Lakoff has done studies based on different rearing styles, contrasting the patriarchal, hierarchical family based on authority versus the collaborative and nurturant parenting style. And he actually goes and tries to identify divisions based upon the emotional basis beginning in child rearing. And I've also read Alice Miller, who talks about how Nazism was so fertile because of child abuse in the parenting within the German nation. So I'm wondering what you think about the nurturing.
Well, I think Lakoff certainly anticipated Haidt. Haidt cites him. The father model, the father and mommy, are conservative liberal types of parenting and mindsets, where I believe, again, it goes back to this idea that I believe that unless you have cases of outright abuse, like you highlighted, it's far more likely to be a biological difference that animates people to go to the left and right. You know, this idea that if you just take a child and give it lots of nurturance and love, it'll turn out to be a little liberal when it grows up is just not true. You might move it a little. We're not genetically determined, but there's going to be a predisposition that's going to end up at some point. That child's going to hear someone tell a story on the political right that resonates with emotions that they haven't really been able to develop so much in the home, but they have peer groups and they have the internet, and they're going to find.
You never make a safe space for conservatives. It's never safe enough.
I'm not sure I follow the question.
In other words, you say conservatism is basically based on insecurity about, you know, not being open to new experience, you know, feeling threatened by outside views or physical things. So really, it's the conservatives that need the safe spaces.
Okay, I'm the reason I'm a little reluctant to engage it with that language is I'm so committed to not using partisan language in my thinking and in my politics anymore. And for substantive and politically beneficial reasons, I mean, liberals, just to flip it a little, liberals are far more likely to be neurotic. We're less happy. Conservatives are happier, especially if you're deeply religious and you're in a tight-knit community. There is overwhelming evidence for this, that you're gonna be a happier, well-adjusted, I would even argue.
So it's almost different fear managing strategies rather than one having fear of that, the other moment.
Well, what hurts liberals is just seeing human suffering, you know, and animal suffering and things of that sort. Right. So it's different kinds of moral valences. And if we as liberal left people want a better world, we have to go beyond just demonizing them as monsters. It's how does that work? They're just going to dig in their heels. So I know that I run the risk of a little paternalism here, but let's be humble. They're far better organized. Their dorm rooms are a lot cleaner. You know, they're getting up early and they're winning, by the way. Look around, what's going on politically, what's going to happen in the next election cycle. So, you know, I think we need to eat a little humble pie, recognize they have moral emotions that animate them. We have moral emotions that animate us. And I think promulgating these ideas and opening, and anybody who wants my email, by the way, I can direct you to like sources that I use that were more accessible. Like I didn't get technical till late in the game on this literature. And I still struggle with some of the complexity of behavioral genetics. So just keep in touch with me and I'm happy to share that.
Okay, everybody, last question. Does anybody have any final thoughts, last questions? Okay, in that case, Greg, do you want to say any last words or?
Well, just thank you all for coming and we'll see you
at our next talk. We're trying to set something up for June 4th. So just be on the lookout for that. And we definitely have something for July 16th. And again, we'll be sending out, you know, publicity and correspondence to everyone. So thanks for coming, everybody.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Mark.
Appreciate it.
Mark, thank you. It was awesome. Again, before you go, if you have not been here, please sign in. I beg you. This is like, we really want to expand this organization. Yes, we do need to check.